Hello everyone. So, obviously the background has changed yet again. I'll probably have to be doing reviews in this setup in my room actually. Unfortunately, I couldn't do the regular setup, and it's kind of unfortunate because the light is probably a bit too bright there. I'll have to check that out. What else to say? At least the Monarch of the Glen is there as well. Well, it's not the other one in the other videos wasn't the Monarch of the Glen, but at least I've got that to make up for it. So it should be not too bad. Anyway, let's get into the review. The last review I did was Marcus Aurelius Meditations. This is Jean Rey's Malpertuis, uh, French, I believe. I probably prefer to pronounce it Malpertuis. It sounds a little bit weightier to me. Perhaps it's pronounced Malpertuis, Malpertu. Jean Rey's Malpertuis, translated by Ian White. Now, this is a strange work. It's from the 1940s. It's translated from the French. It seems a lot older than the 1940s for various reasons, which we'll get into. This is a book that I didn't think I was going to get. It seemed a bit intimidating, if I'm being honest. It's got shades of Gormenghast. It's got shades of Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. I've not read that, but I'm aware of it. I'm aware it deals with monasteries and abbeys and or abbots, and it's very sort of dense and poetic, and there's lots of literary allusions. This is very much the case with this book. I should say, you can see the glossy cover there and reflected in the light. This was published in October 2021. It's brand new. It's based off a 1998 translation of Malpertuis into English from French. And this came out in 2021, so it's very new. It's unfortunately it's a little bit costly. I got this for about £11.76. So Malpertuis, yeah, shades of Gormenghast to me, shades of Dunsany as well. Actually, there's also shades of Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose as well. Various things that can be extrapolated from that. For me, I found that this book was an odd one because I wasn't sure I was going to get it. I mean, I searched for 2 weeks or so to find a book, and I ended up going for this. One of the most, I mean, apparently it's a meta narrative. It's got lots of literary allusions, poetic language. It's even at the end it says that it requires multiple readings. So that was an interesting one for me to pick up, just coming off of certain larger books as well. I was very much intrigued by the cover though. It's a brilliant aesthetic. What I can say about this book, and I'm going to have to skirt around a lot of spoilers. This is a very much it's one of those ones where you have to go into it blind. It's sort of it's a typical haunted house story, but in the least, but in the most roundabout way. It's very much it's all about it's almost, it feels like an onion, actually. I think that's even described in the back of the book in the afterword. So it apparently took Jean Rey about a decade to write, and you can see why. This is only a short book. It's about 210 pages ish, and it's surprisingly in depth. It's one of those books where there's multiple epigraphs on each at the beginning of each chapter, from people like Hawthorne and Poe, and various mentions of Greek mythology, which plays a large part in the book. And actually, that's one of the reasons I got the book. It's I knew that it had references to Greek mythology, and it's a Gothic story with Gothic devices and that sort of grand meta narrative, but then it also harkens back even further to sort of postmodernish sort of meta narrative, but then also harkens back to Greek mythology and also, I believe, certain elements of European folklore as well. I was very much not inspired, intrigued by just the chapter titles alone. For example, Part 1, Electa, opening, the vision of Anacharsis. Chapter 3, the Song of Songs. He who puts out the lamps, the capture of the gods. the Ides of March, the Boundary God. So it's one of those books that it definitely seemed like it'd be sort of up my sort of alley sort of thing. Um, I will say, in terms of the cons, before we get into the pros and then read the excerpts, and I probably will give some spoilers as well. For those who have read it, I'll actually go into some of the positives and negatives on from a more sort of when I've clarified the plot points, I suppose. In terms of the negatives, this is a slow book to begin with, very much so. It's because you're very much drip fed information, and it can be quite confusing. It's deliberately surreal. Uh, the central conceit of the story is that there's a young man called Jean-Jacques Grandsire, father of son of Nicholas Grandsire, and he lives in this house with a man called Uncle Cassave, great Uncle Cassave. And there's essentially how it begins is very, very small scale, and then it broadens out into this almost apocalyptic narrative. I'll just say that. I think you can even find that in certain introductions to the book, so it's not too much of a spoiler. How it starts off is very much a sort of small scale story. There's this will, so Uncle Cassave is dying, and it says that in the very first chapter, title even. Uncle Cassave passes on. Uncle Cassave is dying, and he has a will. Um, that he wants to be read out to sort of the family members and the sort of people that he knows as well. And it seems that the will sort of binds him to the house, and I'm not going to say much more than that. Um, and that's really how it begins. It's a very odd beginning. It reminds me of Gormenghast, actually, very much so. And I'll get into that even later on as well, further later on. Reminds me of Gormenghast in that this is grand narrative, but we start off with very localized events. We have just a meeting in this strange yellow room. Everything seems detached. Actually, there's actually a part in the end of the book where it says, or in the afterword, where it says everything in Malpertuis, the grand house that's owned by Uncle Cassave, seems to be detached or spatially incoherent. So the yellow room will just exist in this sort of blackness, and that's very much what it felt like for me. Anyway, that's just one element at the start of the story where they're in this yellow room. Everyone, you're trying to figure out who everyone is. The problem with this book at the start is that there's a whole cast of characters as well, and that sort of lends to the confusion. So we're not sure where certain elements or certain sort of rooms are in the house itself. And we're not sure who all these characters are, such as the sisters Cormelon and how they relate to the Uncle Cassave. We have cousin Philaret, I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly. We have a strange man called Lampertuis, which is one of the most interesting characters in the book, actually. It's this madman, actually, and I won't go much more into it than that. We have Nancy, the sister of Jean-Jacques. Various characters, I'll say that, various characters, and it's a little bit tricky to get your head around to begin with. I think it might be just deliberately disorientating. And it's one of those stories where you're just drip fed information very, very slowly. And I should say, one of the things I've not even covered is it's actually a very good. I could edit this, but I'm going to keep it in because it illustrates very, very clearly the complexity of this meta narrative. The book begins with not. The book begins not from this perspective of Jean-Jacques Grandsire. It begins with this mysterious rogue-like figure who isn't given a name, but he is essentially the one that compiles this grand story from documents that he finds. Now, all I'll say is that this figure, he finds a pewter tube in a particular monastery, and that's where that's where he finds out the story, and then he compiles the text and tries to make sense of it, and then investigates himself later on. And it's just this onion of a story. It's where the layers are peeled back, very, very labyrinthine, and it's not only in Malpertuis itself, the house, and its sort of spatiality, if that's a word, but also the text itself, and in that sense, it's very much Gorman-Gastian, or Peakian, or however you want to describe it. So I'll say that there's a tendency for the book to feel, at least to me, a little bit aloof. It's it's an odd one. It's because the characters aren't quite as defined as perhaps they could be, and because the spatiality of the house itself isn't quite defined, and it's very surreal how it's described. Um, and because of the many sort of literary allusions and there's a lot of French quotes and all that sort of stuff. It's one of those types of books. It can be it feels a little bit distant to me. I wasn't even sure if I was going to finish the book actually before I really got into it. Um, and so I'll say that's one of the main negatives for me, is that especially at the start, it's a slow start. It's kind of distant. It's kind of aloof, but eventually you do sort of come to care about some of the characters. Although even finishing the book, I have to admit, it's one of those books where I didn't feel much, especially because I have some issues, quite major issues with the book and how the sort of central conceit is presented. I have multiple questions on that front, so it's also makes it kind of difficult to enjoy the story. And I do admit I was reading the ending, thinking just trying to get past it, just so I could finish the book to then research and try and figure out some answers to the questions that I had. Although I've not yet done that actually. So those big questions about the book are still lingering in my head actually as I do this review. But the reason I've not went into those yet is because it's this review is this book sort of lends itself to just a sort of vague sort of discussion on it. So just before I go into the excerpts and possibly the spoilers at the end, I want to give a quick sort of overview or give more concrete details for the book, because I realise I've been talking in vague terms. Um, just beginning with the vision of Anacharsis, this really drew my attention in because it's not at all what the book turns out to be, and it's very mythological and strange. It almost reminds me of that cosmic scene in Hodgson's House on the Borderland, where there are these huge idols standing above the mountains. If you're aware of that book and that scene, the vision of Anacharsis, part one, it begins with this mariner called Anacharsis who is sailing to this island, and he sees these huge figures, these strange colossal figures. It's very mythological and grand and weighty, very interesting. And then he eventually encounters these figures that will become important to the later narrative. And again, there's a lot here. There's the history goes back about 200 years in this book. So 200 pages for about 200 years, really, if you can say that. If I can encapsulate it that way. All these figures like Anselm Grandsire, who's the great-grandfather of the protagonist Jean-Jacques Grandsire. We have the Elder Deuthedam, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's how I pronounce it throughout the book. The Elder Deuthedam is a sort of lecherous priest character, one of the main antagonists, I guess. Various characters like that. So they all have parts to play later on in the story. And so again, once we've finished with the vision of Anacharsis, that's where the main part of the story really begins. And this is all conveyed by this mysterious figure who has taken the text from the pure tube, and he's now disseminating this information. So again, it's very nested narrative, meta-narrative. And so again, Jean-Jacques, he is the main protagonist in the house, and he's really the eyes into Malpertuis. He's really the way that we see and come to know the various strange and unique and sort of idiosyncratic characters like Lampertuis the madman, the sister, the rather headstrong Nancy, his sister, Elodie the servant, Uncle Didaloo, Philaret the taxidermist. There's various characters. I'll let you explore that if you read the book. And again, I want to there's an important point here that I don't want to let get away from me. All these characters are very important. They might seem a little bit superfluous. They might just seem there just as sort of background dressing, but they're very important to the narrative. Um, and really, I don't want to give much more than that, other than to say that it's just this sort of wild ride of um, secrets and vagaries and ambiguities. It begins with this will. This dying man reads out his will, or gets somebody to read out his will, and it ends with almost apocalyptic mythological imagery. There's monasteries involved. There's holy men. I think I'll leave it there. Actually, I don't want to give too much away. A couple of excerpts now, just to give an idea of who this strange figure is that has collated all these texts. The very first page, really. The job on the monastery of the White Fathers was definitely worth the trouble. I could, had I so wished, have made a clean sweep of any amount of valuables, but although lacking in devoutness, I am not an unbeliever, and the very idea of making away with devotional objects, even though they be weighty objects of gold and silver, fills me with horror. The good monks will be weeping over the loss of their palimpsests, their incunabula, and their antiphonaries, but they praise the Lord for his having turned away an impious hand from their ciboria and their monstresses. And he goes on to talk about the purity that he's found. This strange roguelike character who has a sort of mischievous streak to him. Moving on to the opening, the vision of Anacharsis. Now, before I go on to this excerpt, there's an interesting part of this book where there's a lot of epigraphs, as I believe I mentioned at the very start of this, or earlier on in the review. So there's a strange element here where Jean Ray seems to be fabricating a lot of these epigraphs. I think it's meant to just be a deliberately disorientating effect that he's trying to produce in line with the sort of weirdness of Malpertuis, because he seems to attribute certain quotes in works to various authors that actually isn't the case, and you learn that when you read the notes at the back of the book. And he'll create he'll almost world build certain documents as well. So, for example, this epigraph here at the beginning by Nathaniel Hawthorne, I believe it is. This isn't actually written by Hawthorne; it's just him. Jean Ray writing. Anyway, this is a good one to begin the vision of Anacharsis. It is in vain that you build churches, stake out the roads with chapels and crosses. You will not prevent the gods of ancient Thessaly from returning in the song of poets and the books of scholars. So this is a part where Anacharsis has come to the island just at the very beginning of the book, and he sees some strange figures, some colossal figures on this mysterious island. Of this, the horrible stench of anagrus, the thrice accursed plant, came to him from that mortal land, already so close at hand, and he knew that impure spirits were involved in his adventure. Of this he was quite certain when he saw forms floating over the summits of the rock. In their shapes and attitudes they were repulsively human, and for the most part they were gigantic beyond comparison. They gave the impression of being of different sexes, to judge by the strength of some and the relative beauty of others. The dimensions too differed among themselves. Some approached the normal in size, others seemed dwarfed and deformed, but it may be that distance played a part in these discrepancies of vision. Immobile every one, they were staring fixedly into the tormented sky, frozen in a horrible despair. Corpses, he sobbed, corpses the size of mountains. This is the brilliant excerpt for the facade of Malpertuis. There it stands with its enormous pillared balconies, its flights of steps flanked with heavy stone banisters, its cruciferous turrets, its gemmel-barred windows, its grimacing, sculptured, child-eating serpents and tarasques, its studded doors. It exudes the arrogance of its inhabitants and the terror of those who skirt its outer walls. Its facade is a severe mask in which the beholder vainly seeks any serenity, a face feverishly twisted in rage and anguish that fails to conceal the abominations that lie behind it. Those who lie down to sleep in its vast rooms lay themselves open to nightmares, Those who spend their days there are obliged to habituate themselves to the company of the atrocious shades of executed criminals, of men flayed alive, or walled up, or otherwise tormented. Such must have been the unbidden thoughts of the passer-by who halts a while in its shadow. Again, there's quite a large cast of characters in this book, and one of the characters I've not mentioned is Uriel, which is a woman that Jean-Jacques is interested in. And there's a lot of great poetic and quite striking imagery. For example, I'll just say this. I should have liked to have turned and looked at her, but her hand grew still heavier and colder upon me, and I could not make the slightest movement. But a pier glass facing us reflected our images. In it, I saw two green, immobile flames burning, like two enormous moonstones in the depths of an eternal lake. A lot of, just a short example, just a couple of lines on just page 57. There's a lot of great lines like this. So really, I'm just skipping around here. The excerpt that I just read is quite a bit further in than this one, but it's just, there's a lot of great stuff here. It's just remembering it all. It's kind of difficult to find sometimes. Anyway, this one here, this concerns a character called Dr. Sambucus, and he again reminds me of Dr. Prunescholar. The midnight meal was a respectable repast, and a tongue and sauce being served. Dr. Sambucus took advantage of the situation to inform us of the banquet given by Xanthus the Phrygian, at which Aesop was served tongues of every kind, and only tongues, proclaiming them at once the greatest and worst delicacy. I just give that quick excerpt to. It's interesting because there's a lot of parallels with Gormenghast here. And also just to say that there's a lot of allusions like that in the book, a lot of Greek literary allusions, things like that. This excerpt here, from nearer the start of the book, concerns a man called Malpertuis, one of the main characters in the book. So this excerpt here concerns a man called Malpertuis. A strange man has just entered. He is immensely tall, horrifyingly thin. If he had not been bent, he would be well over 6 feet in height. A reddish greatcoat floats about this skeletal creature. His features are obscured in a repulsive, coarse mop of hair. He draws close to the candles, ravished with delight. Ah, he doesn't put these out, not these ones. It's good to see the light. For me, it's food and drink. So that's the beginning of the character of Malpertuis there, the introduction. He almost reminds me of Flay from Gormenghast. So there are a lot of excerpts I really could read out in this book, and it gets a lot weirder, very much weirder, than I'm even hinting at. There's a lot of very surreal and dark imagery. It reminds me of Cuban's The Other Side, especially near the end of that book, when it gets almost like Bosch, like a Bosch painting at times. It's very, very strange, and there's really quite some dark imagery in this book. But I can only talk about it so much. Just a little excerpt here, not on the surreal side, but just to highlight the sort of melancholy nature of the book as well. And I'll say, actually, just before I read it, the book is very surreal, and one half of it is, or it can be surreal. On the other hand, it's not as weird as it perhaps as the allusion to Lovecraft in the foreword might make it seem, but nonetheless it is still quite dark and surreal. Anyway, this is related to the melancholy nature of the book that sometimes pervades. I did not yet dare to admit that, ever since my return to life, I had been missing the sharp savour of darkness, of anxious foreboding, of terror even. A splendid winter sun was gilding everything about me. It hurt my nocturnal eyes, habituated to shadows and to trembling lamps, ceaselessly menaced by impure spirits. I would gladly have exchanged all the iodine and all the salt of the open sea, the effluvia of life itself, for the deathly fustiness that stagnated in Malpertuis. That's brilliant. That's very Gormenghastian. I love that sort of thing. So I think I'll leave it there for the excerpts. There's a lot here. Again, hopefully I've given you an idea of just the scale of it for such a short book, and just how nested and complex and poetic and dense it is. So I think I'll end on it. Just for those who have read it, I'm going to bring up something that that I hope to answer for myself in later research. But for those who have read it, I'm going to talk about a spoiler now. So thanks for watching. If you want to read it yourself and going fairly blind, I realise I've talked a fair amount actually about it now that I've given the excerpts. But yeah, so hopefully you enjoyed that, and hopefully you do pick it up. I think it's worth your time. I was actually going to say I'm 50-50 on recommending it, but now that I've looked back to it and read the excerpts, it's definitely worth your time, definitely. So for those who have read the book, I have a quite big question or concern about the book. It seems odd that Philaret created these bladder-like beings, apparently, at the behest of Cassave, to house the Greek gods. Where I find it rather strange because I don't quite understand the central conceit of the book, because surely these people would have existed before, people like Malpertuis and Uriel. Uriel is a daughter of Uncle Didaloo and Aunt Sylvie. I don't quite understand, because it would make sense if the sort of spirit of the god of the Gorgon, who is Uriel, was transferred into like a child or something like that, and then given to, or actually even that doesn't make sense, because obviously she'd have to be from conception the Gorgon, if you see what I mean. I don't quite understand, because obviously Jean-Jacques refers to all these people. It seems that he knows them from an earlier time before the book began. Like Aunt Sylvie, how can Aunt Sylvie be Aunt Sylvie to Jean-Jacques if... Oh, sorry, I'm getting confused there. Aunt Sylvie is a human. There's Uncle Didaloo, Aunt Sylvie, and Philaret. They're humans. But Uriel and Malpertuis, perhaps he just doesn't know them. It seems a little bit vague to me. Does he know? Why would he call them the Cormoran sisters? Where does the Cormoran sisters come from? If they're the Eumenides, if they're the Furies, how does he know them as the Cormoran sisters? It just seems a little bit strange, and obviously the fact that Isengard is apparently Zeus, how does he get to Malpertuis? Obviously Malpertuis is supposed to be like a fold in space that you can just get there, and I guess he is Zeus. But it seems strange. I'm not sure how these characters end up or start in this situation. How does Malpertuis, how is he Prometheus? I mean, why is his name Malpertuis? Maybe it's not supposed to be known, but I don't really understand how that's the case. I mean, how is this old woman, I think it's Gruel or the Gru woman, how is she, I can't remember the name of the goddess that she is, but she doesn't even live in Malpertuis, so how is she one of these goddesses that the elder Dusadam captured from the island that Anacharsis saw? I don't really understand. Maybe I'm missing something here, especially with the element of the... No, because Uriel is the cousin. It just doesn't make sense, because Uriel is the cousin of Jean-Jacques, but Philaret created the bladder-like being that is the shell that is Uriel, apparently, to house the Gorgon. But Jean-Jacques knows Uriel already as his cousin. It's a little bit strange. I'm not quite sure what to make of that, and it's unfortunate, because that is the main part of the book. I think I'll leave it there. Hopefully I'm missing something, but yeah. Again, anyway, so thank you for watching. Got a little bit carried away there with that question there, but thank you for watching. It's a little bit of a longer review, but yeah, I definitely recommend it, obviously, and if you've read it, Hopefully you, I might even read more stuff from Jean Ray. I believe his short stories are even weirder as well. So that was Jean Ray's Malpertuis. Thank you for watching.